Welcome to ESC TV. My name is Piotr Szymanski and I'm the chair of the Regulatory Affairs Committee of the ESC. We're going to discuss here clinical trials for medical devices, their past, present and future. Now the past is as old as humanity, but the immediate past was not as good. There was an increasing number of recalls of medical devices in the past future. You certainly remember breast implants, metal hip implants that raised enormous political problems also. And the number of recalls was actually greater in Europe than in other areas such as the United States. So there was an effort to regulate medical devices, and there is a new medical devices regulation that is in force fairly recently, and this is present. But the questions that are being raised by the medical devices regulation and actually by the present is how to evaluate medical devices, what should be the clinical trials, how they should be designed to appropriately evaluate medical devices. And the future, I would assume, is an answer to that. A part of an answer will be given by the CORE MD consortium, which deals with regulation or with clinical trials related to medical devices and with the methods that they should be evaluated in very near future. So it is a pleasure for me to welcome here Robert Byrne. Robert Byrne was working on a previous document on the review of the evidence of coronary stents for medical devices that was very much related to the regulatory efforts on medical devices, and is now reviewing CORE MD methodologies for other cardiovascular devices. And it's also a pleasure for me to welcome Stefan James from Uppsala. Stefan, and you were involved in developing registry-based randomized clinical trials and in the methodology of clinical trials. And again, you're also involved in CORE MD, collaborating with experts on certain sets of evidence. So that sets an excellent background to the past, to the problem of what was the reality of evidence for cardiovascular medical devices, the present, so how we deal now with clinical evidence, and future, how should we set up clinical trials in order to appropriately collect evidence and not to over-regulate. So, and here comes the first question, if I may. So, Robert, what is your experience with stents? What do you think? Was the evidence sufficient? The review that you have made, is that something that was satisfactory? Please comment about the past of the evidence.
Well, thanks, Piotr. And I suppose the first thing to say is we have to realize as physicians that we have a key role to play in this process. And one of the nice things about the review that we did of stents was that the European Commission, they came to us. They said, listen, for high-risk medical devices in Europe, there is only one device-specific guidance document, and it refers to coronary stents. They said, we're planning a revision of this document, and we'd like the ESC to provide some guidance on the next revision of the document. And against this background, we undertook a review of the data that was available for coronary stents, and provided a report back to the European Commission. They came to us and said, that's interesting. We see now more studies on bioresorbable scaffolds. Can you produce a second report on bioresorbable scaffolds, which we did. So I think the interaction with the regulators as a physician body was very beneficial and gave us a good insight into how regulation works. So in relation to stents, I would say we generally found that this appeared to be quite a mature technology, that the results tended to cluster around mean values for key outcome measures. We looked at hard endpoints, we looked at surrogate markers, but generally I would say there was a good level of high quality evidence for stents, and that gave us the question, well, looking to the future, do we think we need randomized controlled trials for stents, or can we perhaps have single-arm studies and compare these stent performance against benchmark, a so-called OPC-like approach using objective performance criteria? And actually, we recommended a hybrid model. We said maybe you could have a single arm with an OPC control, and then in the post-marketing phase, after the stent had some type of conditional approval, then you could have a pragmatic, large-scale randomized trial.
Thank you very much. Referring to that, Stefan, if you could come back, well, to the past, 10 years from now, did you at that time think that there is a need to modify clinical trials design for medical devices? Were there any deficiencies? Well, there were certainly many more recalls, and there were certainly many more problems with medical devices on the market. But if you looked at the designs of the trials, were they all right, or did you think at that time that they would require any modification? And what sort of modification?
Yeah, thank you for the question. I just want to reiterate the importance of doing trials for medical devices, considering the fact that there is such an enormous development of devices that we put into patients eternally. You can't take them out. And I think for the future, there will be an increasing amount of devices that we need to treat our patients. So there's a desperate need to be able to do proper research to evaluate them. And there have been trials on devices. I think quite impressive numbers of patients have been enrolled in trials, but many devices have been approved on the market. They have been used without any clinical data, without any randomized data. And we really don't, by then, understand the risks or potential benefits of these devices, neither on short term nor on long term. So I've been engaged in the field of stents and drug-eluting stents and other devices for many years, and going back 10 or 20 years, I was a little bit frustrated that there are so many devices that may be associated with risk, and we really don't understand those risks or benefits. So I was looking at retrospective data and tried to do my best to understand the relationship, but without randomization, it's really difficult to be able to draw causal.
Well, there was a story that was mentioned during the previous ESC TV, a very successful story of randomized clinical trials with TAVR, which was actually, I would consider, a breakthrough in terms of medical devices trials, even though this is just an example of that. But before that, if you look back, I think that randomized trials were not that much popular, were they?
No, for multiple reasons. It is difficult to do randomized trials to some degree and with devices because there are iterations. There is a device that comes on the market relatively soon. You realize, or the sponsor realized, that it has to be updated, so there's a reiteration. Some parts of it are improved. Should you then require a new trial for every new improvement of that program, and at what stages should you require a randomized trial, and how long follow-up can you have should you request, because it's not easy also to understand what items to follow up. But certainly I think there's been a very positive development. There are now more and more trials coming along, and my ambition has been to try to design and come up with good ideas to be able to randomize more patients. Mm-hmm. Because I think it's an ethical requirement for us as doctors not only to diagnose and treat patients, we also have an obligation to teach and to do science with every patient we see. So my dream is that every patient I see or treat in the cath lab should be enrolled in a trial for devices. It could be early phase or middle phase or late phase.
Then comes the next question. Speaking about ethical obligations, speaking about the differences in clinical trials, should there be differences between clinical trials for medical devices and for pharmaceuticals? And if so, what should be the differences, or what are the differences? What are the solutions?
Yeah, I mean, it's a great question, and there are some obvious differences. When we talk about medical devices in this context, we're talking about high-risk medical devices. But of course, there's high-risk implantable medical devices, and there's high-risk devices which are only in contact with the patient for a small amount of time. I'm thinking of coronary guide wires, balloons, things like this. So really, I suppose the focus of the attention is high-risk implantable medical devices. And we know that pharmaceutical trials tend to be considerably larger. Medical device studies are more challenging to conduct. And particularly, there becomes the question of, well, what about sham-controlled trials? Placebo-controlled trials are well established in pharmaceuticals. The analogy would be to do the same in medical device industry with sham-controlled trials. But I think in sham-controlled trials, while we've had some important examples in the past, and I'm thinking of Simplicity HTN3, I'm thinking of Orbita, I'm thinking of a number of other trials in this space, but these sham-controlled trials aren't without their ethical difficulties. With a placebo-controlled trial for the patient, the worst thing that can happen is maybe they don't get an effective treatment. For a sham-controlled trial, not only do they not have the chance of not getting the effective treatment, but they might also suffer direct harm from the procedure itself. So while we do need to embrace sham-controlled trials, we have to realize that it's probably just part of the story in selected cases. And as long as we do all the other things right, we have assessor blinding, we have patient blinding where possible, we minimize the risk of bias.
But still, you consider this sort of trials ethically acceptable and doable with medical devices, with high-risk medical devices, sham-controlled trials, or should it be just placebo? As I said, it's difficult. I don't think there's a one-size-fits-all. We saw Simplicity Hypertension 3 gave us some very good information in terms of the renal denervation space, and now all the studies coming are sham-controlled trials, and with this stringent approach, they're able to show a benefit. There are other areas that are less well-suited, and certainly sham-controlled trials in coronary stenosis, critical coronary stenosis, is difficult to conduct, and you can look at the adverse events in the sham control and in the active treatment groups, and it's something as a community we need to consider going forward. Speaking about the design of clinical trials, what about registry-based clinical trials and pragmatic trials for medical devices? Is that doable? How is it doable? What is your experience? What's the presence?
Well, first to explain the term registry-based. The idea behind that is that we are using registries in which we are collecting data for all the patients. Registries that have been designed to oversee patients for quality control. But since we are collecting data anyway in different formats, we might as well collect them systematically in an electronic CRF. As we do that, we can also just add randomization, and then we'll solve the issue of entering data, keeping databases. So trying to streamline processes. So we have in my environment, we have multiple registries, and all patients are included in those registries for quality purposes. And then we can add just a randomization module to randomize patients. And we've before many of those. It's relatively straightforward for a strategy to randomize patients to one strategy over the other. We perhaps don't even need follow-up, because if we can use hard endpoints such as mortality or other hard endpoints that can be followed in registries, we don't need any follow-up visits. It's slightly more difficult for a particular device, a device versus device, because then we need these two devices specifically, and the control device needs to be well defined and established and available and paid for. But we're doing also stent versus stent randomized trials, and it works well. I mean, there is some burden for the investigator, but it's very limited.
So you say it works well, even though medical devices require sometimes specific safety precautions and specific endpoints to be used in clinical trials. So the pragmatic trials are still doable, and there's still something that could be conducted.
We are running a large stent-to-stent, head-to-head randomized trial on a device that is CE marked, so it's available on the market. We have to add a bit of data in order to understand some of the nuances, stent-related dimensions, measures that we don't regularly collect in our databases. So a little bit more extra work for sites. We do a telephone call to the patients to check for their quality of life, performance, and they can report. But we also follow from the registry point of view re-interventions and And so it reduces the amount of work for the investigator by at least 50 to 70%, which makes it possible to enroll more patients, non-selected patients, into these trials.
Well, unfortunately, time is running, so you have to move to the future. Robert, you're working for the CORE MD Consortium. Could you please describe the goals of the CORE MD Consortium and tell me how we could provide for future a safe and reliable clinical evidence for medical devices that would allow us not to have too many recalls of medical devices, and at the same time not to over-regulate, not to demand too much evidence on clinical devices.
Yeah. So, I mean, the main goal behind CORE MD, which is a consortium of interested stakeholders who are focusing on the regulation of medical devices, and it's led by the ESC. I suppose it's twofold. It's number one, to survey the landscape at the moment. So to look at high-risk medical devices, and not just at cardiology, look at orthopedics, look at endocrinology, and see what we can learn from other branches, and see, well, what are the differences in terms of the amount of clinical evidence that's available for approved high-risk medical devices in the different specialties. Cardiology and orthopedics tend to be the ones that attract the most attention for regulators because they have the largest amount of high-risk medical devices. The second aspect of CORE MD then is to try to look at alternative methods for generation of clinical evidence, of course, to see what we've learned from registry-based randomized trials, to see how that can be built upon, to look at alternative methods of aggregating large data, real-world data, and to see if this can be used for the regulation of medical devices. And I think we're probably all aware that this type of data might be useful in the post-market approval space. Is it robust enough to use for the approval of a device? I suppose that's an open question. When, as a physician, I suppose we say, listen, well, what can we do for the future? Well, I think we can pay close attention that if there are adverse events with medical devices in the post-market space, that we pay attention to it, that we do due diligence, that we notify them to the regulatory authorities. This is part of our duty as a physician. And the second thing that we can do is we can participate in post-marketing studies. And if you have a national registry, of course, then that's easier to participate in and look at the evidence that you have as a country as a whole. But we have a duty to participate in these post-marketing surveillance studies.
Speaking about that, because that's a very interesting point, what should be the balance between the pre-market evidence, so the evidence that is collected from randomized trial before the device enters the market, and post-market evidence, or in other words, how early we could allow the medical device to enter the market, and what sort of safety precautions we should take to be safe, to be on the safe side when it is already on the market?
Yeah, that's a great question, and a very difficult one, I think, because of course we want devices, new devices, to be able to be implanted to help patients. We don't want to request too much of evidence, so we are delaying new devices that are perhaps very meaningful for patients. But on the other side, we don't want to introduce devices that have not been tested and can be associated with high risk. So we need a good balance. And I think that like Rob was talking about, having some degree of evidence generation before it's introduced, but then request post-marketing evidence so that we can see and follow the evolution of these devices and see if there are late complications. So I think that balance is delicate, and I think it's not too bad at the moment, but we need to do more trials, both before and during.
Are physicians sufficiently involved in post-market surveillance and in post-market clinical trials? Do we have systems that are ready for post-market surveillance and for post-market collection of evidence for those devices? That's the question to both of you. For those devices that enter the market relatively early because of the hope they give, because of the innovation they offer.
I mean, I think if we look at the recent past, I mean, we see that there isn't good engagement in this topic. Countries like Sweden that have national registries are perhaps in a better position to generate data, but also if you look back at the polylactic acid scaffolds, we can see that most centres that were implanting these, most centres that were early adopters of the technology did pay attention to duty, had registry data which they made available. When this registry data started to become available, we then started to appreciate a signal of stent or scaffold thrombosis that we didn't see in the carefully conducted randomized trials, or we saw to lesser an extent. So, like, I think there are examples that the system does work in a relatively unregulated fashion, but of course physicians in general, I think we need to become more engaged with the regulators and give them our advice on approval processes and ensure, of course, that our patients still have access to novel treatments.
Yeah, that's one of the reasons we're doing the registries is we are reporting back information to the regulatory agencies on a regular basis. We are also providing the manufacturers the performance of their devices, so they can see trends and look at them, and then do extra studies if needed. But since we are collecting the same data for all patients, all devices, we can pretty easily, quickly see some trends that we can look more into, and that has been extremely valuable.
So there is an extremely close link between clinical trials that we do at our departments and regulators who receive evidence, and safety of patients that we ensure by providing real-world data and post-market clinical trials. We have to conclude, as this is a lovely discussion, but we are over 20 minutes now discussing medical devices, their past, present and future. We could probably discuss it for much longer, as there is a lot of topics to be discussed, and I hope we have another opportunity. Now I have to thank you very much for your presence, for your input to the discussion, and have a nice rest of the day. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you very much for your participation, and